Okay, Bennett, McNulty.
Well, thank you, and thanks to Alan and Zander for organizing this really exciting event. I think that there's a lot of resonances between my talk and the ones that have preceded it, a lot in common with Zander's talk. And I think that there's some resonance with Patton's, with Lydia's upshot about the way in which there are these really historical contingent circumstances that are unlikely to be replicated that made possible the foundation of philosophy of science. I'm going to start with an apology as well that I have no good story about Ron Geary's wine cellar. Unfortunately, I wasn't invited to the Logical Empiricism Conference in 1993. It makes sense, I was 7 years old, but nonetheless. All right, so here we go, a research place of our own. In historical narratives around the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science, a lot of the time it's situated with respect to its more famous predecessor, the Vienna Circle, is what I call the Vienna Circle narrative. We think of MCPS as the successor to the Vienna Circle. Indeed, we find this narrative in David Edmonds' recent book on the murder of Professor Schlick, where he writes, perhaps the most important successor to the Vienna Circle was the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. To some regard, the history that is included in your packets also tells this sort of history of the connection between the Vienna Circle and the Minnesota Center. Indeed, we find this narrative even in one of the primary actors here, Herbert Feigl, who calls the Minnesota Center the Wiener Kreis in America. Of course, there's good reason to make this connection. Feigl was a member of the Vienna Circle. He emigrated to the United States, founded the Minnesota Center, and brought in a lot of the surviving members of the Vienna Circle, a lot of the surviving logical empiricists to come to conferences, to visit the Minnesota Center. And they were focused on questions that the Vienna Circle earlier was also focused on in the philosophy of science. Yet this narrative, although there's a lot to say for it, overlooks some of the disanalogies between the Minnesota Center and the Vienna Circle. Here's just a few of them off the cuff. First of all, MCPS was institutionalized at the University of Minnesota. It was an academic center at the university, established in that way. It wasn't just a collection of faculty at the University of Minnesota that were meeting informally in coffee shops, but rather it was a center here at the university. It was focused on facilitating and disseminating research. One clear example of this is the series, The Minnesota Studies in the Philosophy of Science. And additionally, the Minnesota Center was founded with a large philanthropic gift from the Hill Family Foundation. That's Lewis W. Hill, who founded the foundation in the 40s. Right? Those are all strong disanalogies with the Vienna Circle. So what I want to do in this talk is resituate the way that we think about MCPS, not just as the successor to the Vienna Circle, but as in different and distinct historical narratives. The best way that I can put this is to just lift a quote from Rudolf Carnap. Carnap sent a letter to Feigl that included a recommendation for the Minnesota Center for the Philosophy of Science to be founded in the early 50s. And he included the following description. Sorry, I know that's pretty small, but I'll read it out. So this is something that Feigl included in his proposals to the Hill Family Foundation and to University of Minnesota administration. So Carnap wrote, "And now to the great news about your institute. Let me congratulate you to this remarkable achievement. I can imagine how much work and diplomatic negotiating must be behind it. But more than that, I think it is a great achievement for yourself that you have been able to sell this project so successfully. It is what we have always dreamed about, a research place of our own. where we could gather outstanding young men and have them pursue what they and we think is important research. So I want to think about MCPS as this, a research place of our own. That is, it is a place for the philosophers of science, the logical empiricists, to come together and produce research. And in being a research place, a center, an institute for that research, it allows us to see MCPS with respect to a different contrast class, right? With respect to a different different historical forerunners. In particular, it allows us to see MCPS as contrasted with or compared with some distinct research places, namely the Institute for Advanced Study and the RAND Corporation. And later on, I'll say why I've picked out these two research places as forerunners to MCPS. By doing this, I think it allows us to see MCPS in distinct historical narratives, namely MCPS in a history of academic philanthropy and the way that at this moment in the 20th century was leading to new kinds of academic centers being produced. It also allows us to see MCPS's position in the professionalization of philosophy of science in the mid-century. So first I want to talk a bit about the Institute for Advanced Study and the influence of philanthropy on MCPS before then talking about RAND and the professionalization of philosophy of science. So first, the Institute for Advanced Study. The way that both of these sections will go is that I'm going to talk a little bit about these institutions, IAS and the RAND Corporation, talk about why I've picked out these and what evidence there is that they were inspirations for MCPS, then talk about some specific connections that Feigl or those in his orbit had with these institutions, and then I'll discuss what impact this has on how we conceptualize MCPS. So first, a bit about the Institute for Advanced Study. It was founded in 1933 as a place for advanced research to be done. It was not a place where students were being taught. There was no official lectures, but scientists, especially starting with mathematicians and physicists, were brought to the Institute for Advanced Study to really do cutting-edge research. It was founded on the back of a philanthropic gift from Louis Bamberger, who made his money in retail in a very successful department store, which was later sold to Macy's. And he gave a $5 million endowment to the Institute for Advanced Study. Abraham Flexner, the first director of the Institute for Advanced Study, really modeled it off of Johns Hopkins and the University of Chicago, which were similarly founded on the backs of large gifts from Gilded Age industrialists or investors. Some details about what was happening at the IAS. Like I said, there was a real research orientation to the Institute for Advanced Study. It promoted independence and freedom in research. There was no official teaching, no administrative responsibilities for professors. Sounds nice. And it had this model of residential faculty as well as visitors coming through for a year or a few at a time. The faculty included a wide variety of luminaries in mathematics, physics, economics, art history, including Veblen, Einstein, von Neumann, Weil, Panofsky, and Oppenheimer. Of course, I have to put Oppenheimer on the slide now that he's all the rage. So what's the evidence then that the Institute for Advanced Study was an important forerunner or model for MCPS? There's a lot of evidence, actually. First of all, there's just the original name for the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. So this document here is the first outline that Feigl made to propose the Center for Philosophy of Science in '52. And if you can see up there at the very top, I know it's small, apologies. It reads, first preliminary outline for a project for a Minnesota Institute for Advanced Study in the Foundations of Science. Right? An Institute for Advanced Study. I mean, it would be clear to anyone reading this what analogy he's trying to draw, or what historical antecedent he's trying to point to. Just because I love putting up these fun historical documents, we can actually track the way that the name of the center changes in 52 and 53. So here's a document in which Feigl, in his own handwriting, scratches out the word institute and replaces it with center. So we get the Minnesota Center for Advanced Studies in the, and here's another change, Logic, Methodology, and Philosophy of Science. And then a little bit later, we see another proposal for the project in which he shortens that name, the Minnesota Center for Advanced Studies in Logic, Methodology, and Philosophy of Science, or for a shorter title, the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. That's the first incidence of the name, as far as I can tell. Additionally, in some of these early documents, the proposal for the Minnesota Center that was sent to administrators, as well as the Hill Family Foundation, we find the Institute for Advanced Study as among the contrast class, the institutions that MCPS is doing something distinct from. So Feigl was asked by the director of the Hill Foundation to say more about how what he's proposing is unique. And he responds with this note that you can see on the slide there. He notes in particular that the Princeton Institute doesn't do this work because philosophy of science is there at most a minor and remote consideration. Additionally, in the quote from Carnap, the recommendation for the founding of the center that I mentioned earlier, we find him, Carnap, as well saying that it's a good supplementation to the Princeton Institute, which specializes in other fields. And finally, there is a Feigl interview from later in his life in 1965, in which he talks about the Institute of Advanced Study as a forerunner for MCPS. Again, I know it's very small, but at the bottom of the first column there, we have an interviewer asking him a question about the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. What brought about this center at the university? Feigl responds, well, some of my colleagues and myself were thinking some 12 or 13 years about a sort of Institute for Advanced Studies for the University of Minnesota. It was not the same sort of thing they had at Princeton. For example, when Einstein was prominent. The Princeton Institute was actually created for Einstein primarily, and later on, other very great scientists added to the Institute for Advanced Studies. I don't think Feigl's getting all the historical details right there, but nonetheless, it's clear that it is a kind of forerunner model inspiration for him. So he goes on to say, we had in mind an institute which would pursue logical and methodological research in the empirical sciences, where scientists who were interested in such research could collaborate and consult with us and be consulted by us. On the whole, this worked out very well. So then what were some of the connections then that could tell the story of like how Feigl knew about IAS and took it to be an important model? Well, part of this is just obvious. At the exact same time that Feigl was founding MCPS, Carnap was a visiting member at IAS. Indeed, he joined IAS in the fall of 1952, which is precisely when the first discussions and negotiations for the founding of MCPS start happening. It is in the fall of that year that we get the first documents, the first preliminary outline for MCPS. Additionally, Gödel was an IAS member off and on since its origination in 1933 and became a permanent faculty member a permanent member in 1940, later on becomes a permanent faculty member. Additionally, I mean, I don't have a lot of evidence for the last bullet point up there, but I mean, there is this kind of glorification of Einstein around Feigl and his orbit, right? Schlick was famously referred to as Einstein's pet philosopher, and Feigl was Schlick's student. Feigl had a few letters from Einstein in which Einstein speaks very positively about his book on the philosophy of relativity, and clearly he cherished those letters from Einstein, kept them very safely for his entire life. So the idea that, you know, if it's good enough for Einstein, it's probably good enough for us philosophers of science as well. That is the model of IAS, where it was made for Einstein, right? That's a good model for us philosophers of science. So how can we see the effects of the modeling of IAS in MCPS? We can see this first in the initial proposal for MCPS. MCPS begins as having a very ambitious model of residential and visiting scholars. So you can see, if you look at the documents there, this is from a proposal for MCPS in late 1952. And there's part 3 there, means and instrumentalities. Number 1 under that says a research staff of at least 6 scholars. Sometimes he says more preferably 10 to 12. Perhaps 2 of them of high maturity, the others young PhDs or instructors, to be appointed on an annual but renewable basis. And then in the next section, the tentative outline of the budget, we find a substantial amount of the budget reserved for these 6 scholars at varying salary levels. Only a relatively small amount of the budget is reserved for salary compensation for part-time work of local professors like Feigl, Sellers, Scriven, etc. This is very different from what eventually got funded. In particular, if you look at the bottom number there, it's $80,000 per year. That was the proposal in late 1952. When it was finally funded by the Hill Foundation, it was just under $40,000. And the big cut was to the visiting and residential scholars. Most of the funding went towards local staff that were on part-time course releases. Another way we can see the influence of IAS, or rather this IAS model, is in the funding of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. It was funded by the Lewis W. and Maud Hill Family Foundation, and the Hill Family Foundation got its money from their Lewis and Maud's father, James J. Hill. James J. Hill made his money in railroading, especially being the founder of the Great Northern Railway. So again, we see this pot of new money, right, from Gilded Age being funneled into centers just like Johns Hopkins, just like the University of Chicago, and just like the Institute for Advanced Study. So this funding was absolutely critical to the founding of MCPS. Over the course of its first 9 years in existence, the Hill Family Foundation donated $237,000+. And I think it's worth reflecting on why the Hill Foundation supported MCPS and what was the context for them seeing this as an opportunity. To understand that, one thing we can do is just look at the motivations of the director of the Hill Family Foundation, A.A. Heckman. So in a number of documents, the Kreuter mentioned up there is a history of the Hill Family Foundation that they funded in the 80s. And then the second there, the Heckman from '82, that is an oral history with Heckman that was recorded. In both of these places, Heckman says that he thought it was important for the Hill Family Foundation to fund and find opportunities for basic research. The reason he thought this is because in, I think it was 49, somewhere around 1950, he went to the East Coast, met with a bunch of the directors of the major foundations, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Guggenheim, and he thought it seems like the funding for applied research is pretty well covered, especially by the Rockefeller Foundation. So instead, he thought our money is going to be better spent supporting basic research, things that don't have a clear application or don't have a clear upshot for industry. That is something like the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. Additionally, Heckman thought it was important to leverage the funding that they were offering to create secure foundations for the academic institutions that they were supporting. So this is a segment from the oral history that I mentioned a moment ago, where Heckman is asked about the work that the foundation did supporting academic institutions and centers. And he mentions the Center for Philosophy of Science at the university. I really enjoy the misspelling of Feigl there. You can tell whoever's writing this is like, Feigl? Who's that? I don't know. But then Heckman says in the last paragraph up there, what we did there, and I think it is important because we use this technique on a number of occasions, we were always a little fearful of supporting a project and underwriting 100% of the cost for several years. Then, when it was determined that it was time to terminate support, the project would collapse because arrangements hadn't been made to provide for it in the university or college budget. So, before agreeing to put up any money for the Center for Philosophy of Science, we said, we'll support it over 10 years on a declining basis. The university must assure us each year that it has picked up the slack so that at the end of 10 years, the university is financing it 100%. This proved to be a successful strategy. He's getting some of the historical details wrong there, but the strategy is accurate, and indeed, it did prove to be successful. We can see this because initially administrators at the University of Minnesota were skeptical about finding permanent funding for MCPS. The first letter there is a memo from McDermott, who was the dean of the College of Science, Literature, and the Arts at the time. This is right at the beginning of these proposals in 1952. He says he's doubtful that there's going to be long-term permanent financing. The second letter up there is from University President J.L. Morrill. It was a cover letter to the proposal that went to the Hill Family Foundation in early 1953, and he's pretty wishy-washy about the possibility of there being permanent funding for MCPS. Nonetheless, the Hill Family Foundation gives a 3-year grant to MCPS, and then when it comes up to reconsidering whether they were going to continue to fund, Heckman says, we are willing to give another grant for $118,000, another 3-year grant, if it can be guaranteed that after that time, the university is going to pick up the slack and they're going to fund the center. What ends up happening is that $118,000 grant is extended over 6 years. It is tapering over that time, and there's increasing funds coming from the university. You can see some handwritten calculations from Feigl himself at the bottom there, where he's projecting out a proposal that he can make to the university for how they can increase funding for MCPS over the time of that second grant from the Hill Family Foundation. Partially I'm being self-indulgent because I just love to show all of these old documents and the handwritten calculations of the budget. But I think that there's some important historical upshots from this consideration. MCPS emerged at a kind of exceptional moment in the history of academic philanthropy, where there was this huge influx of new money into academia from the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, what have you. Not really the case anymore. Indeed, the Hill Family Foundation is still around. It's now the Northwest Area Foundation, and they don't really do basic research funding anymore. Heckman was kind of annoyed about this at the end of his life, actually. And indeed, there was a unique situation of the Hill Family Foundation under Heckman's leadership, where it was aiming at funding basic research and filling this gap in funding that the Rockefellers, the Carnegies weren't doing. And then also that philanthropic context influenced the organization and focus of MCPS. With respect to the organization, right, going from $80,000 to $40,000 really changed the model of what MCPS was doing. It became less like IAS in having residential and visiting scholars in quite the same way. I can also say more about how I think that the philanthropic context influenced MCPS. But I want to say something about the Rand Corporation. Again, same structure. I want to tell you a little bit about the Rand Corporation, why I think it was influential for MCPS, connections that logical empiricists had with the Rand Corporation, and then about the effects and how this reconceptualizes MCPS. So the Rand Corporation emerged out of World War II operations research. The idea was, it was really successful to have all of these high-powered analytical thinkers together during the war. The military wanted to keep them together in order to inform their activities, especially surrounding the use of air power and nuclear weaponry. So initially, the Rand Corporation was set up under the auspices of Douglas Aircraft, although they were reporting kind of directly to Curtis LeMay, who was in charge of the Strategic Air Command. Later, Rand Corporation was incorporated as a nonprofit in '48, although still their main client was the Air Force. In doing research for the Air Force, they gave reports on things like satellites. One of their crowning achievements in the early years was predicting that there was going to be a satellite put into orbit like in the next 10 years. They predicted this in 1947 and almost nailed it. They also wrote a lot of reports on nuclear warfare, game theory, Russology, and trying to figure out when the Soviets are going to use nuclear weaponry. And I think one thing that's going to be important for comparing with MCPS is there was a practice of internal working papers, where before you have a report, when there's people just working together on a project, there are these internal working papers that are written and disseminated, and there's restricted circulation and then discussion about those working papers, and it's a step in these broader studies. There's a really great quote about the importance of these internal working papers from May, who I'm citing up there. So May writes, "There was a prevailing belief among the strategists that committing ideas to paper, the simple act of stating one's ideas in relatively formal, logical way, was an invaluable part of the creative process." Right? So the idea of like putting these things in paper and then using them as points of discussion was a critical part of the Rand process. Why do I think Rand was important to MCPS? Well, it gets mentioned explicitly in one of the proposals for MCPS in early 1953, and then also in subsequent proposals, including the formal proposal that went to the Hill Family Foundation. So in this version of the proposal, we have Section 3, description of the proposed policies and procedures of the projected Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. And then following that is a description of some of the procedures, which ends with the following sentence. In many of these specific procedures and techniques, we can profit by the well-known experience of such scientific research groups as that of the RAND Corporation in California. Right? So explicitly saying that the procedures and policies of MCPS are modeled on, among other groups, the RAND Corporation. In this case, the particular connections between the RAND Corporation and philosophy of science, logical empiricism, are manifold. So here are some of the people in the orbit of philosophy of science or logical empiricism that were at the RAND Corporation or consulted with them. There's Hans Reichenbach, who consulted with RAND in '48, Olaf Helmer, who was a student of Reichenbach, and after getting his PhD, was an assistant to Carnap when he was at Chicago. Helmer was involved in operations research in the war, and then later became one of the first members of the RAND Corporation. I love this little tidbit. His ID number at RAND was 5. Helmer spent about 20 years at the RAND Corporation and later was one of the founding members of the Institute for the Future, which did futurology. I'm really interested in working on that. That's going to be interesting stuff. There's also Norman Dahlke, who is a student of Reichenbach, joined RAND in '48, worked very closely with Helmer on various projects. Hempel consulted with RAND in '51. And Albert Wohlstetter, who was one of the most important figures in the RAND Corporation for its formulation of nuclear weaponry recommendations, was a former student of Ernest Nagel's and joined RAND with Helmer's mediation. This is to say nothing about Quine, who actually wrote several research memos for RAND, as well as Nick Rescher, who was at the RAND Corporation from '54 to '56, and constantly is talking about how important RAND was for his work. So what were the effects then of using the RAND Corporation as a model? Well, the RAND Corporation, again, was an institute exclusively for research. The slogan for the RAND Corporation in its early years was a university without students. Again, sounds wonderful. Sorry, I apologize to my students in the room. You're great. I mean, if they're here, then they're the great ones, right? Right, the RAND Corporation really put a premium on open-ended research, where the thinkers there were kind of unencumbered by particular expectations of what they were going to be working on. Hounshell, in an article on the kind of organization of the RAND Corporation, wrote that that RAND developed an organizational culture that prized intellectual curiosity and independence. And I think that we see this reflected in the earliest documents in which Feigl proposes MCPS. These proposals are extremely broad. Here, if you look at the top document up there, he says, here's just some of the stuff that we might work on: description and explanation, operational definitions, logical structure of causation, the structure of teleological mechanisms, et cetera, et cetera. He isn't committal about this is what we are going to work on. It's a model of funding the thinkers, funding the researchers. They will figure out what's important, and they will work on what they care about and think is critical. This, however, is also curtailed in the winter of '52 to '53. Administrators like Malcolm Willey, who has a quote up there, say that they would prefer that Feigl draw up a specific project that MCPS is going to work on in its early years instead of being so broad. This eventually becomes the project in the foundations of psychology that MCPS is focused on from 53 to 56. Additionally, we can see the influence of Rand in the internal restricted distribution of memoranda in MCPS, which again is modeling this practice of internal working papers from Rand. So at the top there, from one of these proposals, Feigl writes, one of the things we're going to do is have restricted circulation of mimeographed pieces of varying dimensions, later publication of articles, monographs, or books. And then a little bit later in that big paragraph, which ends with Feigl's mentioning of the Rand Corporation, right in the middle of that paragraph, he talks about, he writes, as soon as the ideas assume a more definite shape, they will be circulated in typewritten or mimeographed form, both within the center as well as among interested and competent scholars in the country at large, in some cases even in Europe. Right? And if you look at some of the earliest documents from the center in the archive, there are these early working papers and then notes from the discussions that Feigl, Scriven, Maxwell, et cetera, are having on them. And finally, I'm sorry I'm going so long. Too much stuff to go through, perhaps. I think we can also see the influence of Rand in, or maybe a better way to put it is by comparing MCPS with Rand and recognizing the influence that Rand had on MCPS, we better recognize MCPS's role in professionalizing the philosophy of science. So one way I'm going to make this point is by bringing another institute into the mix. I promise this is like right at the end. And that's the Institute for the Unity of Science, which is mentioned as among the forerunners that MCPS is doing something distinct from. So the Institute for the Unity of Science, around this time in the early 50s, had received money from the Rockefeller Foundation and was headed up by Philip Frank. Feigl says, MCPS is distinct from the Institute for the Unity of Science because of the Institute's complete lack of systematic teamwork and stress on the sociological historical studies of science. So I think that in picking up the Rand Corporation's systematic model of teamwork with these restrictedly circulated internal papers, which were then used as the points of discussion to try to find consensus, to try to make progress in the issues of philosophy of science, I think Feigl's painting a contrast with this other approach or this other program for post-war philosophy of science. This is a narrative that I think is best put by George Reich in his book on philosophy of science in the 20th century. In one of the chapters of the book, he paints this contrast between two programs for post-war philosophy of science. One of them is the Philip Frank model that is housed in the Institute for the Unity of Science, which aimed at popularization of philosophy of science, not just towards the public, but also getting scientists of various stripes to be reading and engaged in philosophy of science. It aimed at a quote-unquote active positivism that worked on and was responsive to social issues of the day, whereas the competing model was the model of Feigl and Reichenbach, which aimed at a more technical, professional philosophy of science, even perhaps a scholastic kind of philosophy of science. And I think that in the contrast that Feigl draws between the Institute, which had no systematic teamwork, and the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science, which was modeled on the research think tank par excellence, the Rand Corporation, we see this dichotomy further reinforced. All right, so again, that's what I wanted to say about the upshots for MCPS vis-a-vis the RAND Corporation. It had this research-focused model, and its research practices resemble RAND's, and this is part of an effort to institutionalize and professionalize the philosophy of science. I won't go as far as Philip Mirowski, who says that the professionalization of American philosophy of science in the immediate post-war era grew directly out of the soil of operations research, but I'm not disinclined towards that sentiment, given what I've said about the RAND Corporation. All right, I'm sorry that I've gone so long, but that brings us to the end. I will not tell you about future topics. We can talk about that later. Just a few thanks. Karen Applebaum from the Northwest Area Foundation gave me access to a lot of early Hill Foundation stuff. Henry Chastain, who's here, was a research assistant that helped organize the materials that I've been working on. And his CV's up there. He's looking to go to graduate school. Samuel King, who's also an undergraduate researcher that I've been working with, and then Caitlin Morkin in the university archives. All right, thanks everyone.